So now we talked a lot about from the seller point of view and themes we've seen on that side, Bruce. Let's really talk about some of the themes we've seen for clients. And this really comes... Welcome to the Live Greater View, a financial planning podcast produced by VLP Financial Advisors that discusses life, money, and perspective. We help clients live their best life at every stage through our VLP Live Greater partnership process. Thank you for tuning in. Great. So this is an exciting one, Chris, today. We've got the founder, Bruce Vaughn of VLP Financial Advisors, and also a very interesting topic, and I think one it's been talked about a lot, we can see, especially if you're an advisor in the wealth management space, is succession planning. And Bruce has really been a pioneer in this space. I joined Bruce back in 2001. You made your first succession planning acquisition in 1999, before it was cool.
Yes, it was. I did it then.
Yeah.
And I did it to help somebody out that wanted to leave the business.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
And I, wanted to make sure that his clients did well as he did well.
Yep. And provided a path.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And there's so much stuff that, we've talked about over the years internally where we have just an organic conversation. And then I say, oh, I wish we had a mic, or I wish, we could have gotten all of that. And today's going to allow us to unpack some of those things. So hopefully this will help, a lot of our business clients and just give a peek into some of the conversations we've had over the years.
Absolutely. Let's go ahead and get started. Kick us off.
Yeah. So one of the things that you've always talked about, Bruce, is just this fact that within our business, there's a very stark difference between a job, a firm, and then an actual business. That's something that stuck with me over the years. And, there's some gray area there, but you were just, very specific about there being those different pieces, and there's certain things that go into each one. So I thought that would be a good place for us to start, the differences there, and then obviously what made you take those steps from initially having a job to building a firm and then building obviously a bigger business.
Yeah, I would say when I started it was just me, right? I mean, I had a partner for 12 years. That didn't work out. I started over in 1996, and my wife and I just had our third child, so she was home pretty much the whole time. She was also a CFP at the time, and we just had to figure out a way to make it go. And I got to this point where I said, my day is completely filled up. Like, I have no more capacity to do anything. And when you're small, when you're just by yourself, you have to run the firm. You have to deal with your clients. You have to find new clients. There's a lot going on that you have to take care of. And I just got to the point where there wasn't any more time in the day. And one of our partners, Dan Lash, had been an intern with me. And he came back after a couple of years working for someone else. And he said, I'm not doing real well. How can, what should I do? And I said, you know what? I got a place for you right here. And so that was really my first big hire. Mm-hmm. I had a couple of part-time people before that. They were doing administrative things. But in fact, my first administrative hire was someone who I could afford 4 hours a day, 2 days a week, because that's all I could afford when I started. Anyway, so you kind of, the thing just evolves. And one of the things that I realized a long time ago was that the only way to really do well over the long run is to create leverage, right? So rather than just making more and more money, I just said, well, I'm going to live on a lot less, and I'm going to keep hiring people. Mm-hmm. And I just kept doing that. The first hire you make is hard because you're literally taking a pay cut to do it. Yeah. But then as you get bigger, every hire becomes easier. And you realize that as you hire people, you can find people who are really good at doing what you're not good at. Mm-hmm. And then you just expand from there. And that's kind of where we've gone. It's, we're up to 20 employees now, which is pretty cool.
Yeah. And did you ever consciously make that decision, hey, this is all reliant on me, to now it's relying on not just me, this could actually run without me? Talk a little bit more about that inflection point to where you said, hey, I need to really position this company, not just for when I'm here, but for decades.
Yeah. I think that was just a gradual process. Mm-hmm. I don't think there was any inflection point per se. Although, I don't know, 24 or 5 years ago, I went to a meeting and one of the speakers got up and said, how many people here have a profit in their business? And everyone's like looking around going, what do you mean? And basically what he was saying is, you make money, you pay all your staff and your expenses, and you take whatever's left over out of the business. That's what you live on. And when you do that, the profit is zero.
Yeah.
He says, who's going to buy a business that has zero profit? So I took that to heart. I really started thinking about that. And so I created a salary for myself at that point. I paid myself just like I paid all my other employees. And whatever was at the bottom line, that was my profit. And then when Dan and Rose came along and I decided I wanted to keep them, that was my main motivation. I wanted to grow and make sure that I didn't train them and then they walked across the street and became my competition.
Yep.
So, I could show them my financials and I said, look, we have this profit, and if I sell you this firm, I'll sell you part of the firm, I'll lend you some money, and then you'll get a piece of the profits for the ownership shares that you have, and then you'll use that profit to pay me back. So literally, I was giving them a check, and they were giving me the same check back, pretty much. I mean, it was not quite, but it was pretty much. Yeah. But then as we grew, the check that I was giving them got bigger, and the check that that they gave me was the same size, and eventually they paid off that debt. Mm-hmm. And then we, rinse and repeat. We kept doing that, and so my succession plan started 14 years ago, something like that.
Well, you had to sign an agreement. That was, I think, about 2003. It's a couple years, but you really started the putting everything to paper around 2008. But then the market dropped, and we didn't execute till 2010. Yeah.
Right. So, that was my grand plan. Is we got to. I didn't want Dan and Rose to then go across the street. I just trained some competition bad. And number two, then I had to go find someone else and retrain them. Mm-hmm. That just didn't sound like a really smart thing to do. So by selling them a little bit of the firm, I could lock them in. So it was purely, for me. But no, I locked them in. And the other thing I remember from this meeting was that they said, if you're the only horse pulling the sled, you can only grow so much. But if you bring a couple people in over time, and you make them owners, all of a sudden they're going to work harder because now they're owners. They owe this debt back, and so instead of growing at a linear rate, you'll grow at a much faster rate, and it's, as it turned out, I lent them the money for 6 years, and after 6 years they paid it back, and the piece that I had left was worth more than the piece that I started with 6 years earlier. Right. So it really was a win-win situation for everybody. It allowed them to become owners. It allowed them to grow their net worth. It allowed me to make sure I kept people, and really I felt like I didn't really give up a whole lot.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and that was awesome. Thank you for walking through that. And just the fact, like you said, when you leave profits in the business, then you actually have a business. If you're taking everything home, you can quote unquote call it a business. You're a business owner, but there's not anything left over, so it might not run on its own. And just that part always stuck with me. So that's great.
Yep. And I think the other piece is in this business, it's not just a financial business; it's a people business. And I've got clients that go back, to 1985 is my longest relationship. And so you become sort of friends with these people. I mean, they're important to you. They've helped you get to where you are. You've helped them get to where they are. And you really have a really nice relationship with these people. And if you're just a one-man shop and you get hit by the proverbial bus, what happens to those clients? They're just out in the wind. Yep. And then what happens to your staff if they don't have a job anymore? And so there's so many, and if that happens, what happens to your family? Do they get anything? because they generally don't.
Right.
So, there's more people to think about than just yourself when you're, in this kind of business.
Sure.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about some of the acquisitions that we've done. Specifically, first one you did was in 1999. You've done 9, and we've done 9 as a firm, and including you would be the 10th.
That's the plan.
That's the plan. We're close. So, and one of the things we've always talked about every time we've done a acquisition is something's always different. We learn from all the ones we've done, and then we think everything, but something always pops up.
Yeah.
And one of the things you just mentioned, which I think is really important and really kind of been the basis of how we've approached acquisitions and working with clients, is you've always said it needs to be a win-win-win.
Yep.
It's got to be a win for the seller, a win for the buyer, and it's definitely got to be a win for the clients. So talk a little bit about some of the planning and how some of these deals and what we've done and what you've done to really help advisors through that process.
Yeah, almost all the practices that we've purchased are either 1 or 2-man shops, right? 1 advisor or 2 advisors. And they really none of them had a succession plan at all. And yet they all got to a point in their careers where they said, I'm kind of done and I don't know what to do. And I've looked at other firms to try and buy, and they didn't work out for one reason or another. And because their thought process didn't match mine. Right? I mean, because I do think it has to be a win-win-win situation. If the seller doesn't feel like they got what they wanted out of it, and it's not just money. I mean, it's definitely not just money, but they have to know that their clients are going to be taken care of, because they have this long-term relationship with many of their clients, and it's important to them. So, and they want to make sure their clients aren't being gouged, and that they're going to be taken care of at least as well as they took care of them. So, some opportunities that were out there, we just walked away from because it just our cultures didn't fit, right? But so I think that once we found people that wanted to retire, and we could help them get whatever they wanted, and you talk about money and you say, okay, well, this is what I think your firm is worth, and every firm, as we know, is worth a different amount, because it depends on how old your clients are. If you're fee-based versus commission-based, if you're selling annuities and you've taken all the commission up front and now you just have this big service issue with no revenue coming in, every firm is set up differently, and so you have to help people understand what is a fair price for their firm, what is reasonable. And that's really, with the people that we've helped retire, that's never really been a problem. They've always gotten what they wanted, and they knew, because as we've gotten bigger, the services that we provide are so much more, so much greater than when it was just me, right? I wasn't good at everything. I knew I wasn't good at everything, so I had to hire people that were good at the things that I didn't do well at, and we just kept doing that. And now that we have so many people, I asked you guys for help on things that maybe I should know because I've been in this business long enough, but you can't know you can't know everything about everything. So they knew. So people that we've purchased their practices from, we can provide a better service in almost every case than they could on their own. And so I think that makes people feel really good also.
Yeah. And can you just talk about the timelines, how that's worked? I mean, obviously 9 is a lot. I'm sure some took longer to develop than others, but what would like a typical acquisition look like, or just some of the backstory of how it all, came to be?
Yeah. One of the Financial Planning Association meetings, it was called the IAFP back then, but one of the meetings I went to was on succession planning. And the president of the association at the time, he was the he was leading this thing, and there were 3 advisors in the panel, and I went up to him afterwards and I said, "You look kind of old." I said, "What are you doing what are you doing?" And we ended up talking, and it probably only took about 6 months, and we found a play. He moved into our spot, and I helped him transition his clients. One of the people on the one of the other people on the panel, I called her up and I said, "Hey, what are you doing?" And she said, "I'm not selling anytime soon, but I know someone who is. She's in my little study group." So I called this woman up, and eventually, we found a common ground, and that probably took, I don't know, probably takes 6 months to a year.
Okay.
For most of these things to happen, if they're going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
I think if you go over a year and you're negotiating, you haven't come to a conclusion yet, it's probably not going to happen.
Something's up.
It's probably not probably not a good fit.
Yeah, something's up. And I know some of the firms, it's been straightforward. It's been just mainly advisory clients. But then I know that we've bought primarily retirement plan businesses over the years, as well as a primarily annuity business. Can we just talk about some of the differences amongst the firms that we've purchased and some of the thoughts on that?
Yeah, the 401k business,
That was a quick exit.
that was a quick exit,
Yeah.
and he had already sold his firm. That guy
Okay.
had already sold his firm to an advisor that was with his broker dealer at the time, and it was a done deal. And I called him up. I said, "Okay, but how about your 401k business? We do some 401k. Is your guy, this successor, is he going to do 401k?" And he goes, "I don't think he does." So it was, I carved out a piece that fit into what we do here, that didn't fit into what his buyer was going to do, and so that worked out pretty well. The annuity business, that was a quick exit too. Our advisor, the advisor he was literally gonna. I got a call and they said, "He's going to make this deal tomorrow if you don't step up, and we'd really like you to step up." This is from our broker dealer. So I called him and we got together, and that worked out. That worked out fine. The annuity business, it all depends on how it's structured and how people are doing it. A lot of these older annuity books, people got a big commission up front, and then they didn't get any trails, and so you're servicing this book of business that you're not getting paid for, and that makes it really difficult. And those businesses aren't worth a whole lot, to be honest with you.
And let's talk. We had a few that we purchased that had a mix of advisory and brokerage,
Yep.
and those probably have had the longest transition timeline. I would say, looking back, some depending on the client age, and in some instances we had a scenario where we had to step up because of a medical issue.
Yep.
But those tend to, because those relationships tend to be more sticky with the advisor, and their glide path tends to be a little bit longer. We've had one about a year. I think it was our shortest.
Yeah, I mean, we had one firm, two advisors. They came in, and I think he was with us for 4 years after he joined us. And I'm always like, if you come in, you bring your clients, you acclimate your clients to working with us. When you're ready to go, it's time to go. And we really haven't pushed anyone out.
Right.
If we can make it work, and I always tell people, look, I'm gonna pay you for the work that you do here, and then we're going to pay you for the business that you created, the value that you have in your business. And those are two separate things. And so if the advisor wants to come in and just stay with us for a while, that works great.
Okay.
We'll pay them for the work that they do, and on top of that, pay them for their business over time. And then when they're ready to go, they can go. And that works out really well.
it allows us to structure the deal a little different and give them the flexibility. To use your analogy, our business isn't a light switch; it's a dimmer switch.
Right.
You can,
Right.
you can just keep dimming down and go to less and less clients. And in that scenario, it works out very well. But it does require a very different deal and semantics of how things are going to work and pay out versus those who just it's a quick switch.
Yeah, and for our business here, I think it was 8 years ago, I was still doing all the HR stuff, all the benefits, all that stuff, and still trying to grow the business and run the business. And I remember my goals for the year, I put at the top, I said, I'm going to get bigger to get smaller. That was my goal. And so we hired a director of operations and took away all the administrative stuff off my plate. And then since then, you guys have purchased more and more shares, and I have less and less. So, I've worked myself out of a job. I don't run the business anymore. You guys run the business, which is wonderful for me. And I don't really have a whole lot of pressure to go out and find new clients. If clients come in, happy to take them on, help the advisors that we have continue to grow. And then I've taken my client base and I've been peeling them off slowly. And now I'm down to, I just work with the clients that I have left, and that it's probably, I think next year might be a good 10 days a month, maybe, if I wanted it to be. And it's really nice. I just have great relationships with my clients, and that's all I have to worry about. And you guys have to worry about running the business, and it's wonderful.
It is wonderful, right, Chris?
Yeah, it is. Yeah. So, well, that's great. Thank you for walking through that. And 9 acquisitions, obviously each one is going to be a little bit different, but at the same time, there's probably commonalities that you see across those. Let's talk about some of the common themes that we've seen across sellers over the years.
Well, I think the biggest commonality is that most everybody in this business, and certainly all the sellers that we've encountered, they were all good people. They all cared about their clients. In fact, some of them, you think they were more of a social worker than they were a business owner or a financial advisor. I mean, they really cared about their clients, and they did what needed to be done for their clients. So I think that's that trait, I guess, is what makes it work for us, because they do care so much about their clients, and that's the way we are here, right? It's always the client first. That's just the way we are. Yeah. And I think the other thing is that makes our firm a little bit unique is, we have an open door policy, right? So if I don't know something, I'll walk down the hall and walk into your offices and interrupt you and, get whatever I need. And it's like that for our younger advisors coming in.
Yeah. Yeah. And as far as taking a step back, we always revisit what with prospective practices that we're looking at purchasing with the seller, exactly what their options are. Yeah. Obviously they have a different handful of options. They can either in some cases just continue to let their business go, and eventually it will just roll off. Then there's other scenarios like we're talking about where you take a much more proactive approach. It tends to work out better for the seller, better for the clients. Let's unpack some of those different approaches there.
Yeah, some people will say, what, I'm never going to sell. I'm just going to die at my desk. Well, that's great. I mean, if you really love to work and you don't have anything, and that's the thing, you got to have something outside to go to, right? Yep. They always say, you never want to run away from something. You want to run to something, right? Yeah. And I think that people who retire, sometimes they get pushed out and then they're not very happy in retirement. And sometimes I got friends that flunk retirement. They find another job but I think if you're running to something, you have something outside, that really is a much better thing.
Yeah. And I think there's always going to be, obviously, that relationship that advisors have with clients. You alluded to it, decades of, that relationship, and they become very close with you. And I think...
And if you die at your desk, how's that going to work out for your clients?
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
One day they go, oh, I have a meeting with him tomorrow, but he died. So
I just had a meeting yesterday with a client who said they found out their advisor, they called the office and somebody else didn't even know the advisor died yet. And then, they're like, well, that's great.
Yeah.
The client knew because in the obituaries.
Well, and one of the firms I bought, the woman who I bought her practice, she had been working for this woman, another woman who was much younger than she was. And one day she went to the office, and she wasn't an owner, she just was an employee. And one day she went to the office, and there was police tape, and you couldn't get into the office.
Yeah.
And the owner's husband had murdered her.
Oh boy.
So talk about getting hit by the proverbial bus.
Yeah.
There was no, nothing, you couldn't do anything. So this poor woman who I ended up buying the practice from, eventually, she couldn't even get in to service her clients. There was no succession plan. There was nothing that she could do. And so then the broker-dealer, they came in and they said, well, we're going to just take over everything because we have the legal responsibility to do that. And so, that was a good lesson too, and I think today, the 2018 study I saw said that like 63% of advisors, financial advisors, had no written succession plan, no signed succession plan.
Which is a problem. So not even just talking about selling, it's talking about the thought of even if you don't, if you aren't in a point to have a sell or sell position, you still should have a backup plan.
Absolutely.
So we talk about that all the time.
Proverbial bus.
Yeah, we've talked to other advisors where we've said, hey, it doesn't have to be us, but if you want some backup to your point, if an advisor dies, they have a family and children, they can't pay, the broker-dealer cannot pay the spouse if they're not licensed.
Right.
So, having a firm to just have that backup plan is an opportunity to provide value where none could be.
Yeah. And so, back to your original question, you could die at your desk. Not good for your clients, not good for your family, not good for anybody except maybe you, if that's what you wanted to do. You could sell to an internal person, but most practices, even if you work for Merrill Lynch, big company, you think, oh, that's a huge company. But most people who are working in an environment like that, it's just them. They have their own practice, their own group of clients inside of that practice, and they don't necessarily have someone who can take it over, right? So to develop, to make that first hire, that first advisor that's going to be a full-time advisor who might want to take over your business, you have to take a pay cut to do it. And most people, they start out, they maybe have some administrative help, but then they make a certain amount of money that they're really happy making, and they don't want to take a big pay cut to be able to hire that person. So most of the people in our business, even if they work for a bigger firm, it's just them. It's really just them. And so, that's a very hard road to go down. One of the practices I long time ago, I worked with him. He was part of our broker dealer, and he had a woman who worked for him, and he wouldn't sell her any of the practice. And one day she said, look, if you don't sell, I want to have ownership. And if you don't sell me some, I'm going to leave. And she left. And then he developed another woman. Same thing happened. And she left. And then he got so angry at the whole thing, he died at his desk.
Yeah.
And it was just a disaster. And so developing, getting big enough that you can have, one or more people buy your practice is really hard. I mean, you have to, because usually it takes 2 to 3 people to buy out one advisor. So it's hard enough finding one advisor to take over. Now you got to find two or three to make that work, and it's not easy. So, the other choice you have really is to go outside and find somebody, buy-sell agreement with somebody outside who's willing to buy your practice.
And one of the things we're seeing a lot lately is a lot of private equity and bigger. We've seen a lot of consolidation at big RIAs where they're buying. That's the new trend.
Yep.
Or
broker dealers.
Absolutely. And part of the issue with that is it may not be the best scenario for your staff, especially if you have some long-term employees. Could be, could not be, you don't know. So now we talked a lot about from the seller point of view and themes we've seen on that side, Bruce. Let's really talk about some of the themes we've seen for clients. And this really comes, I think we were talking about this earlier, some of this is projected from the advisor, right? We think that they're not going to want to work with somebody else. They want to work with a woman. They want to work with a man. But really kind of, it's not what we've seen, right? Really, there's all these preconceived ideas that at the end of the day, they just want to know it's somebody they can trust and that their values line up.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think at the end of the day, when you take over a client, when you buy a practice and you start working with that client, you have to walk the walk, right? You have to prove to that client that you are going to do what you say you're going to do. And as long as, and especially if the selling advisor comes in and has a joint meeting with you and says, all right, so we're going to have a meeting. I'm going to run the meeting. Bruce is going to sit in and get to know you a little bit. And then we're going to have a second meeting and Bruce is going to run the meeting and I'll sit in to make sure that everything goes well. That seems to be a really great way to make that transition, to make that handoff. And then you just have to keep doing what you do and say what you're going to do and then do what you said you'd do. And it doesn't take that long. Really, clients, they really just want someone that they can trust with their financial situation.
Yeah.
And just the fact that in that example that the advisor went through that process, multiple meetings, made that introduction, I think a lot of times it gets lost that's advisors actually going above and beyond what a lot of advisors in their industry actually do, and taking one of these other routes where they're essentially end that relationship abruptly or some other way, that they're actually going above and beyond and actually doing that client in some way, shape, or form a favor and their family a favor by making sure that's a smooth transition. Because obviously you can't expect your relationship with your advisor to necessarily last forever. So just wanted to bring that up.
Yeah, it's funny. I have this dentist, and you think, it's a dentist, right? But I worked with him he worked with me for a while, right? And one day I went in and they said, oh, he sold his business. Now this is your new dentist. And I was like, what? Like, where was the personal? This guy had no personal relationship with me, apparently. I thought we did. He talked to me about stuff. Apparently, he had no personal relationship. Really didn't care about me at all. And I think our business, at least for me, I want my clients to know that that I'm going to put them with someone who I really feel confident in, and that they have a great, that they're going to do a really good job.
Yeah.
And for me, the people that we've hired here, I always tell my clients, I think they're all smarter than I am. I think you guys, you're more educated. You just know more about more than I did when I was your ages, right? And so I feel really confident that when I decide to retire, my clients will all be well taken care of.
Must be all that great mentorship.
I don't know about that.
I mean, one of the things we also see with, certainly in a couple practices we bought where the advisor was well in their 70s, is we tend to see as we're having that relationship with the new advisor, and the new advisor is younger, that some of these clients already had a plan B.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. When you get older, like my clients now often ask me, well, when are you going to retire? What are you doing? Yeah. And, my response is, I talked about the light switch and, the dimmer switch. And I said, look, I will give you plenty of warning, and we will have these joint meetings, and I will bring another advisor in and make the like you and I have done on a bunch of clients already. And that makes them feel pretty good. But if I didn't do that with my clients, they would definitely have a plan B. They'd be going out to look for someone else just in case.
Yep. And that is a concern, because especially when you're doing a deal and you start getting into these processes, and the client sitting across going like, when's this over? I got to call plan B.
Right, exactly.
So it goes back to having those, conversations early with clients and telling them, I do have a succession plan. Even if you're still by yourself and it's just an agreement you've signed with a firm or somebody else, hey, I have a thought process and here's where I'm going to go. Because we tend to see that when it hasn't been communicated, it makes things a little bit more challenging.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And, you talked about some of these other practices that we've bought, just the fact that they've been 1 or 2 person firms, and then we fold them into, our larger firm. And with that, the client experience tends to be upgraded. So we go from this initial, period of trepidation where the advisor is not necessarily sure, the client has some sort of hesitation. Then we get through that initial 12 to 24 month period, and a lot of times the clients are saying, wow, now all of a sudden I have access to other investments that I couldn't use before. I actually have a financial planning piece that I'm able to implement over time. So I always think that that's really interesting, that at first on really both sides of the seller's side, so to say, between the seller and the client, there's that hesitation. Fast forward a couple of years, everybody seems to be in a better place.
Yeah, they sure do. And most of the clients that we've brought on through these acquisitions, I say some of them had a written financial plan, but many of them didn't. And even the ones that thought they were in really good shape and they really had confidence in their advisor, you say, well, let's look at what it's going to look like in the future. Let's model out where things are going to go in the future. And they say, wow, we've never done this before. This is really great. This makes me feel so much better. So yeah, we can definitely provide more services than a sole prop can today, for sure.
And that leads to the question at sometimes where our fees have been higher, and we have to have that conversation. And we actually just did that this year with a lot of clients on the last practice we merged in. And that's a concern, right? Because you're always going, geez, what are they going to say? And what we found is that they see the value, right?
Yep. And they say, I really appreciate what you're doing. I love being with you, and you charge me what you think it's worth, and I'll pay it, because and really you look at our fees anyway, and they're below market for the most part. So it's we're not
gouging anyone.
We're not getting people to pay like the big firms. Their fee structure is much greater than ours because they have more overhead than we do.
Yep. And from a seller's perspective, they're looking at their business, the client base they've worked with for a long time, and they always bring up these things that they're concerned with, whether it's, hey, how do we initially communicate this to clients? How do we conduct that initial meeting? After that initial meeting, there's always going to be stuff that comes up after the fact that the client didn't think of during the meeting. There's emails or phone calls. There's always something that seems to come up along the way. I thought it would be good for us just to talk about really that general process of communicating, having those meetings, and just the fact that having that experience across 9 different firms really helps and goes a long way, versus if you're an advisor, you choose to fold into somebody who's never done this before.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing, I was just talking to a young lady who took over a practice from someone else, and she's a friend of a friend. I was talking with her, and she said, I really need to come talk with you. And I said, well, why is that? She says, because everything that we do at our firm is reactionary. Everything that we do is reactionary. And, we're not like that. Like, we have scheduled meetings. We're constantly, getting in touch with our clients and saying, okay, you need to schedule a meeting with your advisor. And we want to see our clients, once or twice a year at least, and unless other things come up. And we're really good at being proactive about getting them in there, right? And turns out that's not the way most firms work. They're very reactionary. If the client calls them up, they take care of the client, but it's not proactive like we are.
And that leads into when we're doing these acquisitions, we've done enough that we have systems and processes. We understand what data we need to get, what the process is from just the introduction to the paperwork to the agreements to making that handoff. And I think that's a big difference from, and just knowing I've been with you for 8 of the 9, well, I guess in 10, 9 including yours, since I was, as you would say, handcuffed. But nonetheless, each one of those was, a little different as far as the process, because for whatever reason, but for the most of it, oversight, the big part, all the parts that we have to do are generally the same. And back to your point is being proactive is our goal is to always kind of stay ahead of that.
Yep.
And I think a big part of it is really having that open communication with the client and the advisor who's transitioning.
Yeah. And we work as hard as we have to work. I mean, we work really hard to make these transitions work, because if we do it well, then everybody wins.
Yeah.
Right. The selling advisor wins. We win by keeping all the clients. The client wins by really understanding and the value proposition that we bring to the table, and they're happy. And so it makes sense to work really hard to get this thing to work.
And one of the things I really admired in some of what you've put together as far as negotiations, and you've always given upside to the retiring advisor if they add value in that transition process. And in every case, they end up making more than what we thought the original deal was, because them having some skin in the game and us being proactive, maybe bringing in additional assets, and that transition has worked out really well.
Yeah, I think that's important too, because if you're selling and you want the most for your practice, you want the most you can get, and at some point you as the buyer you say, well, it's not worth that, but this is what it's really worth, and if we can agree to that, fine. And if we do better, you'll do better, right? We'll make it so that we can give you some upside if things work out the way you think they're going to work out.
All right, so let's kind of in wrapping up, I think one of the things we should talk about is how these acquisitions have allowed you to build us to build this firm where we can bring in younger advisors, younger talent, which is key to your succession plan, which is key to my succession plan, and how that's benefited, our clients also.
Yeah, I think that what's happened over time is that as we've grown, we're clients are getting referred to us. We're bringing new clients, and if we do another acquisition, we bring these clients in, and it's always it's kind of like a moving target. You have to grow your capacity, then you have to fill the capacity, yeah. Right? And you don't want to be in a position where where you're taking on too much and you can't absorb it all because you don't have the capacity. So we're always, like last year we brought in 2 new advisors, yeah. Right? And we're growing some internal advisors. I've some of the people who've worked for me in different positions. My client service manager became an advisor eventually. So you're constantly trying to grow people, grow your staff, grow whether you have to bring in outside people or develop people inside. That's really allowed us to increase our capacity, and we can we bring in somebody from college, and we can pay them a pretty decent salary. We have great benefits, and we can afford to have them do other things for us before they're ready to take on clients, and it's allowed us to grow our bench strength, to grow that staff and make sure that we're training them well, And that's really helped us grow as well.
And one of the things that we've always talked about is just the fact that this business is constantly changing. Every 3, 4, 5 years, there's either new investment products, new technology, new something within the financial planning realm. And clients are best served by firms that are healthy, firms that are growing, firms that are thinking 2 and 3 steps ahead. We're putting together financial plans not for the next 3 or 4 years. It's for, obviously decades. So you need to make sure that as an advisor, if you're going to sell your practice, you sell to somebody who's thinking that far ahead. And obviously, if you're a client, making sure that you're working with a firm that has all of those pieces in place.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I think just in closing, I think a few key points is one, if you don't have a succession plan or a document, really encourage people to do that because it's important. You
Yep.
get hit by the proverbial bus.
And how many people are going to, in our business, how many people are going to retire in the next decade?
40%.
Yeah.
That was the most recent study that I saw, that 40% of advisors are expected to retire in the next decade. The average advisor age is 57.
And how many of them don't have a succession plan?
40% also.
Jeez.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what happens to those clients and their families and their,
Yep.
there's just, it doesn't make sense. We're financial advisors. We're financial planners. We should have the responsibility to plan for ourselves. And, I would say that we have done a really great job with that here. And I'm so happy with the way things turned out for me personally, but I'm also really happy with the way things have turned out for you guys. Because, it's probably the most proud thing I've ever done is, other than my children, to see you guys create this firm and grow this firm and you'll continue to grow it way beyond whatever I could have done. So I think that's the greatest thing about where we are and what we've done. And, I'm really proud. I'm really happy and proud of what you guys have done at this point.
Well, it's been a great journey, and it's been fun. And I can't wait to see where we go from here. And your dimmer switch will take a while, which is good.
Great. Well, thank you both. I feel like we hit on a lot of points, and I'm so glad that we got to record a lot of the stuff that we've talked about over the years. So that was a lot of fun. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Chris.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Live Greater View. If you like what you heard, please subscribe to our podcast on iTunes or Spotify and recommend our podcast to family and friends. To learn more about VLP Financial Advisors, please check out our website at vlpfa.com. Thanks again.
And now for our necessary disclosures. Securities and advisor services offered through Cetera Advisor Networks, LLC, member FINRA SIPC, a broker-dealer and registered investment advisor. All investing involves risk, including the possible loss of principal. There is no assurance that any investment strategy will be successful. The views stated in this podcast are not necessarily the opinion of Cetera Advisor Networks, LLC, and should not be construed directly or indirectly as an offer to buy or sell any securities mentioned. Due to the volatility with the markets mentioned, opinions are subject to change without notice. Information is based on sources believed to be reliable. However, their accuracy or completeness cannot be guaranteed. Past performance does not guarantee future results.